Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Azure podcast with your hosts Sam Foote
and Alan Armstrong.
If you're new here, we're a pair of Azure and Microsoft 365 focused IT security professionals. It's episode 7 of season 4. Alan and I recently had a discussion about Azure Automation. We lent heavily into automating various tasks within Azure and how Azure Automation can be of great benefit in certain scenarios. Here are the few of the things that we covered. We first talked about what is automation and how organizations use it. We also explored how Azure Automation can help with that, and we discussed how to develop and deploy automations within Azure Automation. Just a really quick ask from me, if I may. We have noticed that a large number of you aren't subscribed yet. If you do enjoy our podcast, please do consider subscribing. It really fuels the growth of the podcast to reach more people just like you. It's a really great episode, so without further delay, let's get started. Hey Alan, how are you doing this week?
Hey Sam, not doing too bad. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. It's nearly August, which means it's summer holidays, and everybody else is going on holiday, it seems.
Yep. Yeah, I don't think I'm making any plans this time because it's my daughter's birthday's in August, so
Yeah, busy time ahead for you, definitely. Yeah, and record heat in Europe. So yeah, in some respects, very, very, very jealous of what people have been going on holiday to. But hearing some of the stories about crazy temperatures, it's a bit mad at the moment.
Yeah, definitely in Europe.
Yeah,
and episode 7. How have we got there?
Don't know. It seems, as I was writing the notes for the podcast, I had to double take. I was like, is it really episode 7? So no, yeah, we're flying through this season, definitely.
Yeah, I think we're about a third of the way through from our normal count. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, shall we crack on with this episode?
Yeah. So this episode, I'm basically going to be taking us through Azure Automation, and sort of what's in that solution and how you can utilize it. And so yeah, should we get started?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so what is automation and why do people want to invest in it?
Okay, so yeah, let's take it back to sort of square one, I suppose. Automation in simplicity is literally automating. I'll call it a simple task. I mean, you can automate lots of complex tasks as well. You might have a task that you have to regularly do. So let's think of a basic scenario to start us off with. Let's say you regularly reboot your virtual machines. And let's say you do that on a schedule, as an example. So without automation, you may have somebody, let's say, that theoretical person has to log in at 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning to reboot your server estate. Now, that might be something that you have to do every week. It might be that the amount of servers that you're having to reboot is continually increasing as well. So not only are you repeating that task on quite a high frequency, let's say once a week, but you also might have a scaling issue there where you might be adding more inventory that you've got to manage. And what automation can really do is it can hook into, and when we're talking about cloud automation, I should probably box it into. We're talking about automating various sort of cloud, we'll call it cloud first processes, but it's not just cloud, but let's just talk about those for the moment. And it might be that, instead of you having to reboot those machines manually, you might say, okay, I'm going to start a scheduled job at 6 a.m. every Sunday morning. And what it will do is it will go through each one of the virtual machines that I've got and just hit reboot on it. Now, you might not actually want to do that for various different reasons, because you might not actually want to reboot your servers on that sort of frequency. But what we're really trying to do is we're really trying to take the humans away from those really menial tasks, at least to start off with. When we think of low-hanging fruit, really boring, repetitive tasks that don't require any any if little actual technical ability, to actually orchestrate the function. If there was to say a problem with rebooting a machine, then you might need somebody with technical expertise to be on call or to jump in and help rectify that. But the actual process of, especially if it's a cloud resource like an Azure virtual machine, just doing that inside the actual portal itself it doesn't take any real great expertise, right? So, and I think what's really beneficial about it is that you can divert your technical expertise onto truly challenging technical um, problems and building solutions instead of having to sort of be mixed up and slowed down by the BAU, like the things you do every day. So trying to automate as much of that as possible. Now, there is a real balance because, there is an inherent cost of automation, because we're going to talk about Azure Automation today. But, if you don't have Azure Automation SMEs inside your organization, well, even if you do, there's an inherent cost of, building that automation. But then that can be compounded even further if you've got to maybe go to an external third party to get that automation done as well. So there is an ROI, calculation to be done, because you do have to think, how long is it going to take us to automate versus just actually, manually running the process ourselves. So it might be the example that I use, which is a very basic example of rebooting virtual machines. That could be very little work potentially to actually implement, especially if you don't need things like sliding reboot windows and things like that. Let's just say very simple requirement: all servers reboot at 6 a.m. on a Sunday. Again, probably not a very good process, but it's an example. Then you might say, okay, it might take us anywhere from a few hours to a few days. Depends how much process you've got and documentation, but to get that across the line. And then you could say, okay, after 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, whatever the time horizon is, you could say we would potentially get sort of return on investment in our the effort that we put into actually automating that. So once we get past that point, everything is effectively time profit after that point. And obviously some organizations actually automate processes that directly impact their revenue. So those types of process can be very, very lucrative in terms of their ROI and their payback over a long time period.
Okay, so automation is to help with repetitive tasks where we can, in effect, get a process to automate to do that process for us, so that like you said, you can free up SMEs or highly skilled engineers in the organization to then do some more of the complex things that need to be done. Free up time. So it's not necessarily about replacing people with automation. It's all about freeing them up to do more, I'm going to say, fun things as well, from a from a personal perspective.
The way I look at it is more stimulating activities,
Yes.
right? Because does somebody really want to be waking up at 6 a.m. every Sunday to reboot the servers, right? And I know that's a silly example, but when you do have these like menial tasks that just take up people's time, and also it's context switching away from what they're actually working on day to day, where you do have what I'll call like low-hanging fruit automation, it's kind of a no-brainer to automate. And again, I do have to emphasize there is a balance of that, because you could spend 6 months, 6 years automating a process that only runs once a year, and that wouldn't make sense. So there is a calculation that needs to be done about time invested versus time recouped over the lifespan of the process.
Yeah, and I guess it's also automation also helps reduce, in some scenarios, reduce the amount of human error that may happen. Like you said, waking up at 6 a.m. to boot that server, maybe your alarm doesn't go off. Maybe you haven't set your alarm and all of a sudden they're not booting. Now you've missed your change window, etc. That sort of stuff.
Yeah, maybe it was the Christmas party the night before,
Yeah.
and maybe clicked on the wrong, set of servers that get rebooted. Maybe there are multiple, there's many different things when humans involved, and me being a human, I see that in my own day to day anyway, right? It's in my opinion, where it makes sense to, it's very, very effective to essentially instruct a computer to do a lot of those activities for you.
Yeah, well, when it's repetitive, you kind of sometimes go into autopilot, don't you? And yeah, I know how to do this. To click, maybe miss a step. Problem caused.
Yeah, exactly.
Not intentionally, but it just is what it is. Okay, so what are some of the common scenarios then for automation? You kind of said about rebooting servers. What's some of the others?
Yeah, you might also want to build a process where you sort of build and deploy resources automatically. Maybe you want to, refresh secrets in Azure or something like that on a periodic timescale. Many different things that you can automate in the cloud for building and deploying resources. You might have periodic maintenance, so it might be things like purging old data from databases, re-indexing SQL databases out of hours, that type of things. You might want to wait and sort of watch, and I'll talk about watchers. You might want to respond to certain alerts and events happening in real time. So you might want to catch something happening maybe in a different system and respond to it whenever you see it. And potentially you could never have that level of response with a human anyway, right? If you want to detect when, a file drops into a folder somewhere, and if that happens in a different time zone, it could, the amount of people that you would have to have a good sort of SLA on that process could be very expensive. There's also hybrid automation, which we will talk about as well. But that's basically where you can run automated jobs on like on-premise servers or even infrastructure as a service. So we're not just talking about automating sort of cloud solutions, but we're also saying your bare metal servers and your IaaS servers being able to run on those actual machines, which can be very helpful for different types of workloads as well. Monitoring, feeding in resource usage, collecting, monitoring data, those types of things can be very powerful with Azure Automation. And it also integrates with a bunch of different other services, like say Azure Virtual Desktop. You can orchestrate scaling of VMs. There's different ways of doing that, but that's a common scenario that you might want to use it for. You might want to look at the changes in your environment. You might want to run an automation script to identify sort of maybe what's changed over a period of time, and maybe you want to alert on that. Maybe you've got your own custom alerting that you might want. They're just a few, scenarios. Another one I should probably call out is scaling resources automatically. It may be that you want to scale your e-commerce front end instances at the weekend at certain times of the year because that Black Friday, Cyber Monday, Christmas, all of those events, you may want to use automation to pre-scale some of your infrastructure. And you could basically bake that process into an automation. And nobody can ever forget, to bump the web servers before Black Friday. It could just be completely automatic ahead of you.
Okay, cool. Some of the things I can think about as well, general processes might be exporting data and importing to another system. That might be a manual process.
Connecting two systems that have no integration between them, right? Building a bridge between them. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, things like that. And we think about instant automation as well. You've got Microsoft Sentinel and automation coming out of that as well when you get alerts, kind of similar like you were saying about monitoring. So yeah. Okay. So could we have an overview then, Sam, of what Azure Automation is?
Okay, so I'm just going to first call out that there is sort of a wider arching sort of collection of tools which really fits under like automation in Azure. So you've got things like logic apps, function apps. You've got automation accounts, which we're going to talk about today. You've even got things like flow and all many different manner of automation tools, right? But what I'm specifically going to talk about today is just process automation with automation accounts. We will do a further episode sort of comparing automation serverless no-code tooling in one big sort of automation episode, because there is a definite conversation to be had about how you pick and maybe how you mix and match those different workloads. So we will cover that. So there's sort of many different ways to approach automation in Azure is probably the one key thing to understand. But automation accounts effectively allow you to run on Azure and also on on-premise workloads, on-premise resources, so non-Azure, code and scripts, which can effectively, you can define your automations in. So what it is it's basically a container that is managed and hosted, orchestrated by Azure. You effectively give them your process scripts. They help you with things like connections to other tooling within inside of Microsoft, storing your secrets or getting your secrets from other places within Azure. They'll also give you the structure around the types of scripts that you can upload, how they're triggered, how they're run. So, for instance, you could have a process that's run on a schedule, and you could define a very simple schedule, like my Sunday morning at 6 a.m. schedule. So every Sunday morning, a process wakes up, and then it says, oh, it's 6 a.m. on a Sunday, I'm going to run. So you'd have like a scheduled or a timed trigger. You might also trigger a workflow from, say, a webhook. So you might have another system, and this is where sort of the collaboration and integration perspective comes from. You might have something like a logic app or a custom app that you've made that wants to trigger a job or a process to be run, and they could use a webhook in order to integrate with that. Also, and I've briefly spoken about it before, you can have watcher jobs, which are effectively constantly looking for changes in other systems, sort of polling other systems for changes. So it might be that you connect it to a file store, and when a new file is dropped into that file store, then you run an automated process. So there's sort of, but that orchestration is all handled by Azure for you, right? You tell it when and how you want your processes to execute, but you do not have to manage the sort of environment that orchestrates that execution. As long as you work within the parameters that Microsoft give you, which is pretty damn flexible, to be totally honest with you, that a large part of that is taken away from you. It's also probably worth me mentioning at the moment is that there are sort of high availability scenarios as well with automation accounts, where you can effectively run like a second automation account in a different region. So if you do have concerns about high availability of your process, maybe they're critical to your business workflows, there is also effectively a disaster recovery and a high availability strategy built in, which is when you start to get to those types of scenarios, that's when these types of solutions become very complicated to manage yourself. It's how does it fail over? Does it fail over correctly? How once it once everything's been restored, how do you fail back? Well, fail back, move back to the primary instance. Those types of things are where you're starting to add more and more complexity. And if you can imagine, if you're especially a smaller organization, if you can imagine, getting somebody to build that level of orchestration for you, it would be, well, it's a product in its own right, So, if you're in the business of selling widgets on your e-commerce store, you should focus on selling widgets on your e-commerce store, not managing your automations and orchestrating your automations, right? Azure is effectively giving you this functionality. Well, they're not giving it to you; you've got to pay for it. But they're essentially giving back this technology for you to utilize inside your organization. We talked about non-Azure workloads, and what we're probably better off saying there really is yes, non-Azure. So we can utilize a technology called Azure Arc. Did you do an episode on Azure Arc, Alan? Have we got an episode?
No, we've talked about it because
should
of
definitely do an
Defender
episode
Cloud.
on. Yes, we did. Yeah, that's right. Note to self: we should definitely do an Azure Arc episode. But what Azure Arc does is try and do it in one sentence. It effectively gives you a proxy. I don't know the best way of describing it. A proxy resource in Azure for a non-Azure hosted machine, right, Alan? Is that the best way of
it's a management engine agent that you sit on non-Azure infrastructure that allows you to then manage it via Azure.
Yeah. Okay. So you effectively you basically can then manage the machine, the device instance, whatever it is, inside Azure, but without it actually being in Azure. And what you can then use is you can use that technology in combination with automation accounts to push those processes down to those non-Azure workloads. And what's really powerful about that is that you could have, let's say you had quite stringent networking requirements, right? And if you had like an automation that ran in Azure that needed to talk to, say, let's say your on-premise SQL database, as an example, getting a singular, point-to-point connection or some sort of way to access that SQL database could be quite complicated. And instead, if you do Azure Arc, and please jump in here, Alan, if I'm sort of representing what the benefit of that is. If you can all sort of approve Azure Arc to go in, you've effectively got that connection there ready to go that can be utilized by other different services, right? There's many other things inside of Azure and technologies that utilize Azure Arc. So you effectively set it up once, and then you can sort of use it as a connecting point between Azure and those on-premise infrastructure, if that's right.
Yeah, it doesn't actually create a connection per se, but yeah, you're right that you can start configuring things like you said, like your hybrid worker for automation, and that automation might be doing those. Maybe you want to do your, like you said, the tidy up of SQL. Maybe remove old data, etc. Maybe you've got some SQL queries that you need to run against it constantly to optimize the database or something like that. Talking like I know what I'm doing there. But yeah, you can do that. But like you said, when you have to try and manage that automation service on premise or in other cloud in non-Azure, that could be quite difficult to have. You might have to spin up a server just to hold all your scripts and everything and hope it works, kind of thing. So that's all sort of managed, like you said, by the Azure Automation account from Azure, being able to tell it to go and run on that machine.
Yeah, definitely. And I think those types of, I know you mentioned it's not a connection, but those types of connecting those two systems can be a challenge in itself, right? Especially with different networking requirements there.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, it isn't a direct connection, but yeah, you can get processes to run that way if you allow them. Okay, so you kind of talked about it, I think, but yeah, how are process and tasks executed? I think you kind of talked about scheduling and webhooks.
Yeah, so I suppose the two sort of places that they would be, executed is either directly within sort of a sandbox inside of Azure. So that's where you can. What's great is you get an element of compute within inside of Azure, inside of your pricing. So there's no. You could, in theory, if you had a cloud only automation, you wouldn't have to spin up any other resources other than Azure Automation, which makes things very, very simple from a deployment and management perspective. And yeah, and then the other side of it is having that hybrid worker agent that allows you to then run these workloads automatically and gather the results back to Azure without actually having to. Well, you have to set up the Azure Arc connection, but from my experience of that, Alan, the most complicated part of that is the networking perspective of it. If you've got supported, operating systems. So once that's in place, that sort of gets you your ability to talk both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. The Azure Arc going in isn't overly complicated. Like you said, it's more networking to allow it out to communicate with Azure. So, okay. So, they're scripts. So, what languages and platforms are supported in Azure Automation accounts?
Okay, so basically the two main languages are PowerShell and Python. So, and both of those, are very popular scripting, and they're both programming languages. Is PowerShell programming language or is it a scripting language? I'm going to call them both programming languages because you can do so much in PowerShell, right? Even if it's not. So they're both really, really powerful there. So what we've previously talked about on the podcast is more low code or no code solutions. Maybe we've talked about logic apps or flow, where you effectively drag and drop your blocks of logic in, but you write very minimal code. This is sort of the other end of that. So this is more like Azure Functions and app service applications, where you're basically writing PowerShell. I think it does scripts and PowerShell workflows, I believe, and also Python scripts as well. It probably is worth noting that there is actually like a GUI editor for PowerShell scripts and PowerShell workflows as well, but I've personally never used that before. But apparently you can effectively drop in commandlets in and sort of draw flows between things. I assume it's just write PowerShell like on the other side of it. So really for me, what's really, really powerful is that you effectively have script and commandlet libraries that you can pull from. So you can share, you can download like gallery automations and scripts. You can also bring in other like commandlets and packages into Python as well. So it's not like you've got a really isolated environment. You can actually pull in logic and processes from others and third parties to actually build really, really sophisticated and high functioning automations. The fact of being able to, run a PowerShell script without a server is very similar to Azure Functions. And I suppose we will do a further episode comparing why you may use one or the other. But really, for a cloud only scenario, they are very similar, really, with the way that they hook and they connect to different things. But obviously on Azure Automation, you have a bit more of a restriction in the programming languages that are available. You you've only got PowerShell and you've only got Python, as far as I know. So, if you're there in those technologies, this is going to be really powerful to you. Now, a lot of automation scripts in the Windows ecosystem, especially on servers, is PowerShell, right? It's vastly used for actual server scripts and things like that, and so that makes complete sense. And also, arguably in the Linux realm, I mean, there is Bash, obviously, and there's many others, but Python is, really popular there. And to be fair, now that PowerShell is cross-platform, you're starting to see PowerShell and .NET, more and more supported on Linux. Actually, it's a really good experience there. So you effectively had both. You've basically got coverage of both Windows and Linux as well with this, which is really, really powerful for hybrid workers.
That's great. I think as well, I don't know if it's for hybrid working or not. I think it is, but you think when you're setting up putting your scripts in, you can affect, say, what PowerShell modules you need for it.
Yeah.
So you don't have to potentially worry about in your script getting them all downloaded, installed, because in effect, I think you get like a worker, don't you, an agent that changes all the time, so they've got to be installed every time. But I think that all does sort of that part for you. So it's quite easy.
It basically handles all of the pre-script life cycle of your script, right? You don't have to, like you say, script installing a bunch of different modules, and then so that you've got those commandlets, right? You basically bring them in, and then you can start using them straight away.
Cool. Okay, so how do we manage the content within an Azure Automation account?
Okay, so you can do it via the portal. So you can effectively go into the portal and start writing a PowerShell script in the portal itself. You can also, there's a Visual Studio code plugin, which is really quite powerful actually, because you can actually trigger runs from Visual Studio Code as well. And you can publish from Visual Studio as well. So if you do just want to, fire a project up on your local machine, you can just effectively use that plugin in Visual Studio Code and just connect straight into it. You can also connect an actual code repository to it as well. So that will be synchronized in. So if you're currently using something like app service or function apps where it's connected to, say, a Git repository, you can also do that with Azure Automation. So you can effectively develop, completely segregated, and then maybe you would use a DevOps, a CI/CD workflow to promote content into, between develop, staging, and your production environments in Azure Automation.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it sounds nice and easy to sort of manage. And I think you can deploy stuff via Terraform as well, can't you, into there as well?
Yeah, so it's probably worth talking about the content and the actual resources as well supported on the ARM REST API. So you get good coverage on the SDKs that are provided by Azure, and also in Terraform and other sort of IAC like providers, I assume. ARM templates, and also subsequently Bicep templates as well.
Okay, cool. So this all sounds really good. So the question that everyone loves: how is it priced?
Okay, so like a lot of other things inside of Azure, it's consumption based. So there's two different sort of cost metrics. There's a job running, basically a price per minute for a job run. You get 500 minutes for free. I assume that's per subscription. I don't know at what level that free actually hits. Yeah, I think it's subscriptions. Don't quote me on that. So you get 500 minutes for free, and then it's $0.002, which is 20th of a cent.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah, I think so. per minute of runtime, basically. So, and what's interesting is there's no sizing skew for like performance or limits like that. It's not like Azure Functions where you're charged like per gigabyte second that you've used of memory. It's just a flat for every minute that you're running. It's going to cost you, a quarter of a cent. No, it's a quarter of a cent. Yeah. So for every minute, it's a quarter of a cent. And then you've also got watchers. So watchers are charged per hour that they're actually watching. So you get one watcher for free, basically, a month. You get 744 hours, which is, I use 732 for my hours to month, but 744. And then that costs a quarter of a cent per hour that it's running. So if you were to run, let me just fire up my calculator because I haven't actually done this one. So if you do 744 times 0.002, you're looking at, I'm just making sure I got my zeros right. You're looking at $1.50 a month basically to run a watcher. But I assume once the watcher executes, you're then paying for the job runtime on top of that.
Yeah.
Now, the only thing is, and this might be a question for you, Alan, because somebody asked me this the other day, is I believe that you're also charge job runtimes for hybrid workers as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's what we believe, when we were looking at it.
Yeah. So if anybody else knows, please do fill out our contact form on the website and we'll definitely shout you out if we're wrong there. But yeah, we do believe that even though you're providing your own compute, you're still going to get charged for orchestration and integration from Microsoft on that front.
Yeah, I guess it's monitoring it, isn't it? At that point, how far it's got through the script and things like that.
Exactly.
So it's
yeah.
that.
So they're still going to have to run some sort of I suppose they're still going to have some sort of resource in Azure waiting for that process to finish, right? It might not be actually executing the code, but it's also, like you say, orchestrating the process as it goes through.
Okay, so is that sort of everything on the pricing side? It's very, excuse me, it seems very simple.
Yeah, like it's weirdly simple because like on the automation pricing page on Azure, it's also talking about configuration management and also update management, which we haven't gone into today because they're sort of other automation aspects of quotes Azure automation, not just process automation. But process automation is just like literally 2 lines in a single table. It's like very, very, very simple.
Wow.
I also assume that if you go into high availability, you're also just charged for those running as well when they kick in. So very simple to actually price. I suppose there is no sort of what's the best way of describing it? There's no like fixed price allowance that you can go onto. You can't buy like a block of minutes or hours. It's literally just consumption. So I know some organizations can be a little bit concerned about that because they can't, unless their automation is very, very consistent, they might not actually be able to plan very effectively in terms of those costs. But I think if you were ending up using enough to really sort of be a real cost in your organization, you might want to also look at potentially other solutions as well that could maybe give you a bit more of that stability. You might say, okay, we're going to port our PowerShell scripts into function apps and buy app service instances for them because then we know we're going to get consistent, costs in the business.
Was the watcher price the same as the automation, the runtime?
No, it's a quarter of a cent per hour for a watcher, and it's a quarter of a cent per minute for the job runtime.
Yeah, okay.
So you're paying $1.50 a month for the watcher just to be active, and then you've got the actual every time that watcher runs, you pay the quarter of a cent per minute.
Yeah, I was just going to try and work out how much that was for it to run for a month, because that would then tell you a max price, then, wouldn't it? And if it's anything less than that, that'd probably be your best bet for calculating.
And I've just worked out it's not a quarter of a cent; it's a fifth of a cent. So I got that wrong. But yes, I see what you're saying. Like, how many minutes are there in a month, and how if you absolutely like, if you just ran it constantly, like how much it would cost you.
Yeah, but that's cool. So we kind of talked about sort of the networking side of things. How is connectivity handled? Is there a way of hooking it up to VNets, things like that?
Yep. So VNet is supported in Azure Automation, which is another really powerful benefit of it, because we know from other automation and low code, no code solutions, you have to really bump up to potentially quite expensive tiers in order to get VNet support. So to see VNet support in a sort of consumption based pricing model is very refreshing to see. That's for sure. I personally think in order to get hybrid workers working, they've got to have a lot of that strong networking capability there anyway to do those connections. So it doesn't surprise me that VNet support is sort of baked in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it means that you don't necessarily, if you don't want to run the hybrid worker in potentially run the hybrid worker in Azure as IaaS, then you can hook up to the VNet, or you can run remote commands down to, if you've got a VPN in place, then run them down to your on-prem if you don't want to open it up to the internet. I'm thinking of
exactly
your because you got to have Azure and Azure Arc being able to go out and the automation account service being able to communicate with it. So
yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
there's sort of so much that I haven't really talked about. Actually, there's not really that much. I think the only thing I've probably missed is you can also manage certificates that your scripts might need as well. So it helps you to orchestrate certificate management as well, kind of like other Azure automation service as well. And I think that's probably it. Really, is there any other questions you've got, Alan, or any other bits? Because you've used automation accounts as well. Do you think there's anything that I've missed?
What about things like the identity that the script is using? Because I know that you can.
Yeah. So we used to have run as accounts.
Yeah.
Public service announcement, 30th of September, I believe, this year, they're being retired. So if you do have any run as automation accounts, maybe check that out. But now they've moved to manage identities for effective integration into Entra ID. Yes. I was going to say Entra external ID. I still can't get my head around it. I'm sorry. It's going to take me some time. So for integration into Entra ID, you've effectively got a managed service, a managed identity, like a lot of other services and products in Azure.
Yes, I think that was for all the interaction with Azure side of things, but I think your run as accounts might still work for the hybrid workers when they're on premise, because you may have a local account there. But I think talking to Azure externally, things like that, it's like I said, managed entities.
Yeah.
So no, that's the only thing I can think of at the moment. Used them a little bit. A colleague of ours, Chris, has used them quite a bit in the past and recently. So
yeah, definitely.
And Luke.
Yeah, and I think for me, there's a lot of different ways to approach automation in Azure, and it really does come down to like looking at each one, understanding its capability, and really picking the right tool for the right job. And if you do want to run in a hybrid sort of setup, executing commands and scripts on on-premise servers, there's from what I know, that there's very little that even comes close to it in Azure, to be totally honest with you.
No, not without having a direct connection to a server in Azure talking to your on-premise and running those commands, and then having to manage that hosting of that and paying for it, etc. So yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so is there anything else, Sam? Is there anything else you want to shout out about?
No, the only thing is I'd probably call out the previous episode that's sort of linked to this one. So season season 4, episode 3, I did an episode on function apps. So if you do write PowerShell and Python scripts that you want to automate, might be worth you checking out that episode, because I do talk about function apps, and there's a lot of similarities there between the two. So definitely do go and check that out. So Alan, it's your episode next. So what are you going to be covering?
So I'm going to talk about zero-touch deployments with Microsoft Intune. So it's looking at Windows Autopilot, Apple Business Manager for Mac and iOS, because we've had some experience with those, and some of the Android zero-touch, which is slightly different because it sometimes depends on the vendor.
Okay, great. Yeah, looking forward to that. That's definitely a witchcraft and wizardry when it's all linked together, right? You know, that sort of open the box and, you know, it knows who you are is, well, it knows a little bit about you is kind of scary sometimes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so did you enjoy this episode? If so, please do consider leaving us a review on Apple or Spotify. This really helps us to reach more people like yourselves. If you have any specific feedback or suggestions, or we got something wrong, we have a link in our show notes to get in contact with us.
Yeah, and if you made it this far, thank you for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Yep, thanks all for listening. See ya.
Cheers, bye.